Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's episode by episode review for Lost Season 4 Part 2. So this video is a part of a series of videos where I cover every episode of Lost in parts. In this video I will cover episode 8 through episode 14 of Season 4. Which is up to the Season 4 finale. So of course I'll have to give a spoiler warning for up to the very end of Season 4. If you haven't seen all the way up to the end of Season 4, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. However, this video will be free from future spoilers beyond Season 4, so if you haven't seen past Season 4 all the way up to the end, do not worry, I will not spoil anything beyond the end of Season 4. However, I will have a spoiler section at the end of the video for those who have seen all the way up to the end of the season, or the show, I should say, the end of the entire show. But I will give a proper spoiler warning before getting into those. So, Season 4, I'm going to start this video at episode 8 of Season 4, but as I explained in my first part of Season 4, is that there was a writer's strike that happened, so the show was off the air for like, I think maybe 4 or 5 months in the middle of the season, and during this time everything was in limbo. We didn't know if they were actually going to get a chance to finish the season or not, because we had no idea when the writer's strike was going to be resolved, what's going on. And of course, whenever there's a writer's strike, it always, even before the show is taken off, it always affects the quality of the show in question, because even when the writer's strike is coming, because people are preoccupied with it, and qualities of shows tend to go down. Just look at Next Generation Season 2 with Shades of Grey, or Heroes Season 2 for this writer's strike was around the same time that it really suffered. And I talked about in the first part how I thought the first part of Season 4 kind of suffered. I mean, it was still had some great episodes, just as a Constant, which is considered by many to be the best of the episode of the entire show. But for the most part, I didn't think the quality, barring the Constant, was all that good in the first part. However, after episode 8, they actually did get to finish out the season, starting with episode 9, but they had originally planned to do, I believe, 16 episodes in the season, but they had to shorten it to 14 episodes because of the writer's strike, because after they came back from the writer's strike, it was, I want to say late spring, I think April, or maybe March when the writer's strike ended, but they still had to write the episodes and produce them, which is takes a while. So they didn't have that much time, so they couldn't finish out their full season. I think even as is, they ended up going well into June just to do up to episode 14, which is typically, shows like this like to end in May. So but the writers really had ideas. They really wanted to finish out the season and do Season 4 properly. And as I said, the second half of the season is when this season gets really good, because even like Damon Lindelof talked about this himself, about how in the first half of the season, and as I said, this probably had to do with the writer's strike that was on the horizon, that they were really not into it. They felt exhausted and tired, and they didn't feel invigorated, and they felt like after the break of the writer's strike, they had this renewed energy and this renewed love for wanting to finish it off. And I think that really, really shows. I think the quality of episodes, starting with episode 9 up to the end, were all top notch. And this is like a run of really great episodes. There's one exception in them, but I'll get to that. I mean, it's not bad, but it's kind of mediocre. But the rest of them are like really great. High quality stuff. Now, episode, as I said, I had to split the video this way just to have it, half the season. So I'm actually going to start with episode 8, which happened before the writer's strike, or before the break. But I actually think that's a pretty high quality episode too. which I'll get into shortly. So I would actually bunch it in with the high quality episodes, even though technically it's before the break. But you can kind of tell, even in that episode, even though I like it, you can kind of, the tiredness in the writer's room does kind of come off. Whereas when you get the end batch of episodes, you do feel that renewed sense of energy and that renewed sense of determination to try to run towards the ending. Now, also, but because of the writer's strike and because they had to shorten the season, there was a couple episodes they had planned that had to get scrapped because they didn't have as many episodes anymore. And some of them they had to, mostly it was like flashbacks with the new characters such as Charlotte or Daniel Faraday and Miles. And I think this did severely affect the show because you see in later seasons they had to try to backtrack to these, and it doesn't fit as well in those later seasons. You could tell they were actually meant to happen in season 4, but oh well, you can't control stuff like writer strikes, although they could have planned things a bit differently, but whatever. I don't really have any complaints, as I said, because the last set of episodes in season 4 were really great, although as I covered in season 3 review, that at the end of season 3 they were supposedly sat down and wrote an outline for the last final 3 seasons on exactly what they were going to do, but as I'll cover as I get into these future seasons, I think they keep changing their mind. I think there's wild inconsistencies, not even within those 3 seasons, but within each season itself. Now, season 4 itself is not that bad, although I can tell that after they came back from the writer's strike that there's slight inconsistencies. You can tell that there's some things they were planning for in the first half that because of the shortened season or for whatever reason, they changed their mind, sort of went in a slightly different direction. But in season 5 and 6, within season 5 and 6 itself, I think they drastically changed their minds, and there wasn't even a writer's strike then. But of course, I'll cover the seasons when I get to it. Anyway, let me go ahead and get into this batch of episodes, starting with the first episode, which is episode 8, Meet Kevin Johnson. Now, I think this episode is a bit underrated, personally. This has always been, I wouldn't say one of my top tier best episodes of the show, but I always latched it in with my favorites, so like maybe the second tier of really powerful, good episodes, because this episode is very dark. It's one of the darkest episodes of the show, I should say. And I think they accomplish it in a very powerful way. Now, for those of you who weren't watching the show as it was airing, you might not be aware of that. Michael was the main character of seasons 1 and 2, and in season 2 he left the island and disappeared. So throughout, when season 3 was airing, everyone, message boards and the internet was like, where's Michael? Where the fuck is Michael? Where is Michael? Why aren't you talking about Michael? So in between seasons 3 and 4, they went to the Comic-Con and they announced they had the actor who played Michael come out, and Harold, I can't pronounce his last name, but anyway, he came out and at Comic-Con and it was like, big surprise announcement, I'm going to be in season 4, and he made this huge announcement, and it was like a big deal, oh, Michael's coming back, and then he didn't appear. As I said, there was, before this huge break of the writer's strike, there was 8 episodes, and he didn't appear until episode 7, and second to last episode before the break, and he was only in it for like a couple seconds or like a couple minutes. And then episode 8, the last episode before the break, is when we finally get his episode, and then it turns out to be even shorter season. So really, I would call Michael's appearance in season 4 more as a cameo. And by the way, the actor who played him, his name was in the opening credits for the entirety of season 4. So even if you had missed like all the Comic-Con announcements, all the online articles and everything, even if you haven't been paying attention to that and you missed the announcement that Michael was going to be back, as long as you're familiar with the actor's name, right there in the freaking credits from the very first episode of season 4, even though he doesn't even appear until halfway through the season, and even when he does appear, he doesn't appear that much, so he's technically not a main cast member. I think they just had to, for rights or whatever, pay him that much, but so, and given the credits for it. But point is, it was no big surprise to those watching the show, and I think it really deflated the impact of Michael returning. And so that's why I think this episode's underrated. I think a lot of people were underwhelmed by the, and the way they play it on the show. They play it like it's a huge shock. Like when Michael first appears in episode 7, I remember everyone was like, "Yeah, that's so dumb. They're playing it like we don't know who it is. Of course it's fucking Michael. They've been teasing this all season." And then episode 8, when Ben was really, "Oh, my spy on the boat is Michael." And this is another thing that really annoyed me, is throughout the first half of season 4, everyone would always ask Ben, "Oh, who's your spy on the boat?" Like, that doesn't really make sense in the universe, because you would just assume it's one of the others, someone that they don't know. So why are they asking for the name? And Sawyer or Locke and Hurley keep saying, "Oh, who's your spy in the boat?" He could just say, "Oh, this is a guy named Bob," and they'll be like, "Well, who's Bob?" "Well, he's one of my people." "But you don't know him. Why are you asking?" So the fact that they were asking specifically for a name and that Ben was refusing to give a name implied it was someone they knew, which was actually extremely unlikely. Therefore, the whole thing was extremely contrived and annoying. Like at the start of this episode, Hurley says, "Oh, he won't even tell us who his guy in the boat is." Hurley, what if it's just some dude? What makes you think you even know who the guy is? What difference does it make? "Oh, this is Steven." Why do you care? It's because the writers knew it was someone they knew. In fact, and they were all shocked when it was someone they knew. And I was like, well, if you're so shocked at someone you knew, why do you keep expecting it to be a big deal who the person... I don't know. Anyway, I did like the episode itself. It did give a lot of backstory of what was happening to Michael since the end of season 2. I think... maybe if you're watching it in the binge, it probably works better, this reveal. I think, but the way they did the promotional material around when they first released this episode, I really deflated the power of this episode and the surprise of it. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why people don't like this episode as much as I do. Because for me, it's not just because even though there was no surprise for me, I still was invested in the character of Michael, and it was great to get his backstory. Now, another downside of this episode is that Walt doesn't appear, even though Walt is very central to Michael's story, and it doesn't make sense for him not to appear. But he can't appear. I mean, perhaps nowadays they could use CGI or whatever, but I'm sure that would be expensive as hell even now. But back in like 2008 or 2007 when this aired, they couldn't really do that because the actor who played Walt had aged, because this episode aired, like 3 or 4 years after season 1. And, the actor who played Walt was like 11 or 12 or something in season 1. But since that time, he went through a thing called puberty and became really tall and with a deep voice and looking absolutely nothing like his 11, 12-year-old self. Whereas in universe, this is supposed to be taking place only a few months after season 1. So, and this is something the writers talk about. This is the reason why they wrote Walt off of the show in the first place, is because they knew that they wanted to have each season take place within the same year, and so it wouldn't make sense to have this kid suddenly become huge and age like 4 or 5 years when it's all supposed to be taking place in the same year. So that's why they wrote him off the show. But that also created an issue for this episode. Now, they did kind of use old footage of Walt. I don't know if they used CGI, but they did sort of superimpose old footage of Walt for like a brief instant. But that's the best they could do back here. I'm sure in more modern times they could do a better job. But because when Michael went to see Walt, who's staying with his mother, they had a scene where he's talking to his mother. and then he could see Walt looking out the window, and that's all we got of Walt. So they use like image, recordings of him from season 1, so it would match up. And I don't blame the episode for that. I think they did the best they could because they had that restraint of reality on them. That the actor looked nothing like he did that he's supposed to look like in the episode. So, considering that, I think they did the best they did because they at least had him as a presence, even though they couldn't use the actual actor. They still had Michael was obsessed with Walt, and he tried to talk with Walt, so they got an actor who plays his mother and had her be the surrogate, being like, no, explaining what Walt is feeling, and then we see what happened. We hear about what happened between Michael and Walt through Michael's musings about how he told him about how he killed Libby and Ana Lucia, and then Walt refused to speak to him after that, which makes perfect sense for their characters. So I think it all worked. I didn't have any issues with that. Now let me get into what I did have issues with. And that is Mr. Friendly, a.k.a. Tom, appearing on New York to Michael. Now, when I had actually read this in the spoiler before Season 4 aired, and I assumed that it was a foiler. I assumed, as soon as I read it, I was like, that's bullshit. Tom's not going to appear to Michael in New York because that makes no sense. But then I saw this episode and I was like, holy fuck. The writers really don't give a shit about continuity, do they? Because if you watch Season 3, which this episode, like the flashbacks with Michael are supposedly taking place during the events of Season 3, because Naomi came to the island at the end of Season 3, and Michael left the island at the end of Season 2, so this is taking place in between that. Obviously, because Michael was on the boat Naomi was on, and he's still in New York. It was before the end of Season 3 when Naomi came to the island, so it was somewhat around the time during the first half of Season 3 that these flashbacks are taking place. It's shortly after Michael got back to the mainland, they said as well. So, Mr. Friendly around that time was on in Season 3. If you put your mind back to this first half of Season 3, Mr. Friendly, aka Tom, was whining about how no one could leave the island. And he was saying that after the Purple Sky, they lost contact with the mainland, and that they couldn't, they were stuck in the submarine. It was a huge plot in Season 3 of how, because Ben was going to send the submarine with Jack and Juliet off the island, but he was saying that they could never come back because there's no way for them to find the island because they lost contact presumably after the Desmond turned to failsafe key and electromagnetism and screwed everything up, so people could no longer go to and from the island. And yet Tom was back on the island at the end of Season 3, where he got killed promptly by Sawyer, and he was involved, I think, in the storyline with Locke was joining the others. He was there the whole time, and at the start of the season, he was there with Jack playing football, and even before that. So when the fuck would he have had time to leave the fucking island and come back? And more importantly, how the hell did he leave the island and come back? I know they tried the lame excuse to try to dismiss this when Michael asked, what, so you can just leave the island? He's like, some of us. So I guess that tried to imply that he's special. But again, I cast you back to Tom bitching and whining about how no one can leave the island. If he's one of the special people who can leave, then why is he complaining about this? Now, you could just say, well, maybe after Tom was whining, Ben was like, hey, guess what? I think you're special. I want you to go to the mainland. But how? Because when we first saw this episode, we didn't know how Ben got off the island. We knew from Saeed's flash forward, that Ben did get off the island. So at this point, we thought maybe there was a special magic door that like a transporter or like a Stargate or whatever, where people could teleport off the island and come back. But we find out later on that is not the case, because Ben had to turn that frozen donkey wheel, and I'll get into that later, but it's implied that it hasn't really been used before. because it moves a whole freaking island. And it's a one-way trip, has been described at the end of the season, that he's stuck off the island, so he can't come back. So that can't be how Tom left the island and come back, and they can't do it with the submarine. So how the fuck did he do it? Doesn't make any sense. Now this might be another thing, because as I said, this episode was written before the writer's strike, so maybe they had originally planned there to be a teleporter to allow people to come to and fro. When they came back, they changed their mind and wanted Ben to be stuck off island. So this now makes no sense. And there's a lot of these inconsistencies in later seasons. In fact, they get much worse. But this Tom thing is pretty bad. But anyway, sorry, I had to vent about that. But barring that, I mean, I understand why they do it character-wise. It makes sense to have Tom be the one, because he was the one who took Walt away, so he had more of a connection to Michael than any of the others did. But it just does not work for continuity in the slightest bit. It's dumb. It still irritates me to this day. But anyway, regardless of that, I did really like this episode. It had that sort of dark, twisted, weirdness that Lost is known for, the sort of fate thing about how Michael kept trying to kill himself, but the island wouldn't let him do it every time his jam gunned or whatever. That was really creepy. And it was really interesting, too, that Michael became suicidal. It did kind of make sense that if Walt was like refusing to speak to him, plus the guilt of what he had done it was a really dark story, and actually really works for the story they set up. And I also like how Michael goes on the boat and does this mission for the others, which it seems like that would be the last thing that he wanted to do after what the others did to him. But of course, as he's told and shown through his experience, that it's the only way that he can die. Plus the whole thing, I love how they tied in the whole thing of the fake plane being found at 8:15, where everyone thinks they're all dead. I think that's the reason why we couldn't get Michael in season 3. That's why they had to wait till season 4, because they had to tie it into this storyline, tie it into him being on the freighter. And of course we get to see some characters like Minkowski and Naomi, who are on the boat, who already died, which is also pretty cool. And to see in the show Miles and Lupita's there and stuff like that. So that was all cool to sort of tie everything together and to show that how Michael was there the whole time. But the part where he had the bomb and he pressed it and this flag just pops up to say not yet, and Ben's like, I have to show you that I'm different than they are because I'm not going to kill everyone. I thought that was kind of dumb. And like this whole insistent that Ben keeps insisting that him and the others are the good guys and they don't kill people is nonsense, because we've seen throughout the entire run of the show that they do kill people and they don't care about killing people. So for him to say, I care about everyone on this boat is, I don't know. But anyway, do really like this episode. I thought it was very, very, very creepy and a good way to tie in Michael's backstory. So anyway, let me get into the next episode, where is the first episode we get after we come back from the break of the writer's strike, and that is The Shape of Things to Come. And this is a very good title for the episode. Now I think it's kind of a meta title, because this is, I do think that they had gotten invigorated and decided a new direction to go in, particularly with season 4. That maybe was a bit different than what they were thinking of for the first half of season 4. So this is the episode that shows you the direction, this new direction that sets it up, and it does a really good job of it, by the way, that they do want to go to. Now, of course, not everything was completely changed, because at the end of episode 8, Rousseau and Alex well, not Alex, but Rousseau and Carl are killed, and Alex is taken prisoner by the Kimi, by the mercenaries. And so this episode definitely is in keeping with that, is fluid with that. It continues that storyline and takes it to the natural process. Although it does seem like the whole thing with Locke, Team Locke, whatever, like they were making such a big deal about, oh, there's a Team Jack and Team Locke, and they're hanging out in the, whatever, the barracks, Dharmerville, or New Otherton, or whatever you want to call it. Like, that all comes to an end in this episode, so it does seem like, what was the point? Like, they were making such a big deal out of it in the first half of the season, and now it just ends here, but whatever. I love this episode, if I'm not being very clear. This is one of my favorite episodes of the show. Because I think it is so powerful. It does I think it is one of the most, like, monumental episodes that will be called back to many times in the future, because this is when Ben's daughter is killed, and she's killed because of his arrogance. They play it off later as if it was because of his lust for power, but watching this episode, I don't think it's so much his lust for power as it is his arrogance, that he feels like he's always in control and that he controls everything. And that's something we've seen throughout the entire run of the show that he's been on, is that he's always been in control. In fact, that's something I always complained about in season 2 and 3, that the others were pretty much indestructible up until the end of season 3. The end of season 3 changed that, but up until that point, they always win. And Ben's always in control. He always manipulates people. He always is the mastermind, always knows what he's doing. And so I think the death of his daughter was more showing him that he's not in control, and showing him that he's being too arrogant, and that he's not just the powerful mastermind. And because he tried to, the way he was talking to Kimi in that moment was the way he'd always talk to people, like, I know what I'm doing, I'm in control, you can't do anything to hurt me because I control everything. And then Kimi's like, okay, fine, shoots her. That was a really changed narrative to show that Ben was not in control, and it completely threw his whole world into chaos. So for the rest of the season, he's a very different person. You see how strongly, and I think this was played out so well, how strongly the death of his daughter affected him. And it wasn't just because his daughter died, which would be enough, don't get me wrong, in its own right, but also because it showed him that he's not in control anymore, that his arrogance is not justified as he thought it was, that he's not this huge mastermind, manipulator who controls everything. That's all gone. He thought he could control Kimi and everything, but that element was actually out of his control. And what in actual fact ended up happening is his daughter ended up dying with his last words that she ever hears him say is, I don't care about her. She means nothing to me. Oh, God. I mean, to rub salt in the wound, that is just awful. Now, obviously, like, he didn't mean those things. He was saying them to try to manipulate Kimi. But still, like, even if she understood this intellectually, for those to be the last things that she heard him say, that's got to weigh on him. So it was an extremely powerful arc. Now, I also have to talk about this. Even as much as I love this episode, it does set a trend it starts a trend that gets worse in later seasons that I really, 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 really hate. And that is just getting rid of the minor characters. And this is something I will correct in my own, like, fan fiction version of Lost, is that up to, for the first 3 seasons, they had a bunch of characters known as Socks, who never had any lines, whatever, and they were never consistent, but there was a number count of how many survivors of 815 there were. It was like 48 to begin with, and that number slowly ticked down as they started killing off randos, but it mostly stayed around, like, the 40 mark, I think. But this season is where it starts to rapidly go down, and it started with this episode where basically all of the Socks who went with Locke got killed, and most of them got killed off screen because there was just, we saw 3 people, randos. You know, it's also kind of fun, and it also annoys me how no one cares about them, because they've never had any of the meetings that Locke has. They just have the main characters, and then when Sawyer goes to save someone, he just goes to save Claire. He doesn't give a fuck about all the other Socks, and when he sees them, he's like, oh, go back inside, and they just get killed, you're killed, you're killed, and we're just meant to believe that they're all killed by the end of it. I'm not sure how many people went with Locke. I would guess when thinking back to the first episode of the season, it was at least half the group, so it had to be at least 8 or 10 of them, or maybe even 15 if we're meant to. There's 40. Yeah, if about 15 Socks, I would say. So with the main characters, it would be about 20 people who went with Locke. That sounds about right to me. So we're meant to believe, like, even though we only saw 3 people die, that all 15 died off screen. And that annoys me. I think that's very lazy writing, but it's going to get worse later, so I'll get into this in future seasons a bit more. But this is where it starts. As Hurley said, it's where it starts. And so that really annoys me about this episode, but I still love this episode, as I said. Now, when, like, the actual episode itself was really super intense. Of course, this is one of the more action-packed episodes. We got, like, explosions, machine guns firing, and it was really intense. As Ben was explaining, it was shock and awe. They were doing it to try to scare them into giving up Ben, which pretty much worked for as far as Sawyer was concerned, but they managed to talk him out of it, saying that as soon as they give up Ben, they would kill everyone else on the island. I don't know if that's true or not. I think, judging by later when Kimi talks about torching the island, I guess it's the case, but if you look at it in the bigger picture of the show and Widmore's motivation, it doesn't really seem to make any sense, but whatever. A lot of this season doesn't hold up to the bigger picture. Anyway, speaking of things that don't hold up to the bigger picture, there's the thing where Ben calls the smoke monster. My God, that was so amazing. We never seen the smoke monster used in that way. That was I was like, that scene alone, like, was just so awesome. I can't describe. I was just like in trance when watching this episode. Like, oh my God, Ben's calling the smoke monster, and to see it like killing Kimi's people. That was so intense. Now, the next episode, it was basically just one guy got killed, which is not what we're seeing in this episode. It's kind of like the Dothraki in Game of Thrones magically coming back to life the next episode. But whatever. That's the problem with the next episode. They're like, actually, we don't want Kimi's people to be dead. We still need them to be antagonists. So let's just say this one guy got killed, and that's it. We saw them getting slaughtered in this episode. But anyway, still a really amazing... Of course, like the flash forwards that I didn't touch on yet with him and Saeed, I wouldn't say they were the best, but it was interesting. I love how, and you have seen up to the end of season 4 when watching this, so I can talk about this, is I love how the start of this episode, the flash forwards, is the exact moment that continues after the end of Ben's storyline in season 4. That's great. I love that symmetry of that, and this is part of the reason that makes it obvious that this episode, after they came back from the writer's strike, is when they're really playing things down, because a lot more things like sort of click like that. For example, of having the first moment of Ben's flash forward being where he appeared after he turned the Frozen Donkey Wheel at the end of season 4. That was some really, really good stuff. But the flash forwards themselves of him like finding Saeed, and it's also, of course, him not knowing the year, because it also, later on, you find that he actually time traveled. It didn't just take him to the other part of the world. He time traveled a year into the future. This is why he was like, what, 2005? He's like, yes, of course, 2005, duh. He's like, oh, yeah, okay, smiles goofily. Like, that was cool. I did like that. But, yeah, for this thing of him finding Saeed, like, this is supposed to explain how Saeed ended up working for him. And I don't completely buy it, to be honest. I mean, I think they need a bit more. I mean, obviously Saeed would want to kill the people who killed his wife, but what they didn't sell me on as much is why he believes Ben. He knows Ben is a liar and a manipulator. So how easily Saeed falls for it, you could say he's grief-stricken, but why would he just take Ben's word for it that this guy was speeding away from the place he crashed? Like, you think Saeed would at least interrogate him first before killing him to try to get to the truth rather than just taking Ben's word for it. But then that wouldn't match up with what we saw in The Economist. So, I don't know. It felt a little, not too badly, just a little plot contrivance there to make it fit, and it doesn't completely all add up for me anyway. But of course, the final episode or final scene of the episode where he confronts Widmore was fucking amazing. That was intense. That was what really happened, where he's like, I'm going to kill your daughter because you killed my daughter. And it's just like, yeah, that really set things in motion. And it should be noted that the actor who played Widmore was touring, doing a theater production in London. I think it was some sort of Monty Python thing. And so when they tried to get him, he wasn't available. But they wanted him so badly, they flew to London with, the small crew and, of course, Michael Emerson, who plays Ben. And they filmed, so that one scene where Ben goes to Widmore in London, they actually filmed that in London, because usually everything else they film in Honolulu. Hawaii, they just dress it up, like the stuff in Iraq, I'm sure, was filmed in Honolulu. They just dressed it up to try to make it look like Iraq. And I do think they said in the behind the scenes stuff that this was the first time they had filmed outside of Hawaii. And you look at it and it's like, the scene itself just takes place in an apartment building in like a hotel, so they actually easily could have filmed that in Hawaii. Like, it is not very. You have this one exterior shot of London, which they could have just either faked or got stock. They didn't actually need to go to London to get it, but they did. But it didn't have to do with them wanting to have the location of London. It had to do with they wanted the actor, and he couldn't leave London because he was in the middle of a stage production. So, like, they wanted him in that scene so badly, though, they were like, we'll come to you. And again, it probably wasn't planned out that well because of the writer's strike, so he couldn't just put his career on hold. So he went into the stage play, and then they wrote the episode, but he had already had this other commitment. So they're like, fuck. But they wanted him so badly that they moved production over there, and I can see why. Because that scene really makes the episode. That really is the exact punctuation that you need, and you need to have Widmore after that huge event. You need to actually see him on screen. So I can see why they probably really upped their budget a lot by having to go all the way to London just to film that one scene. But I definitely see why it was worth it. I'm pretty sure that was probably a hard sell to the studio, but then Lost was such a huge powerhouse, probably one of the most popular shows, that they had a lot of credit that they could spend. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, episode 10, Something Nice Back Home. Now, when I talked about how there was one mediocre episode in the bunch, I'm referring to this episode. I wouldn't say this episode was bad. But watching it again, it is really the down point in this final run of episodes. Now, I do see why the flash forward storyline was necessary, because you need to have Jack's character go from point A to point B. Now, we actually did see point B first, which was the flash forwards at the end of season 3 through the Looking Glass, where Jack was depressed, he's suicidal, he's popping pills, he's a drug addict, and you find out it's because he desperately wants to return to the island. So all the flash forwards we see in season 4 take place before that. And one of the earlier ones we see is when Hurley flash forward, we see Jack comes to him, and Hurley's like, the island wants us to come back, and Jack's like, we're never going back, and he gets upset, and also he seems very professional. He's a doctor, he's not a drug addict, he seems like a very in control of his life kind of guy. So for how does he get from that point of being this upstanding, doctor who's living a nice normal life, who never wants to go back to the island, to the point where he's a drug addict and depressed and suicidal and desperately wants to go back to the island? So we need something to bridge that gap, because all the other flash forwards dealt with other characters, mainly didn't deal with Jack. So they needed to have something in between, and thus we get the flash forwards for this episode. And it's better than nothing, I'll say that, but I don't think it completely, because that is a huge character journey to go from that to that. And I don't think this episode totally sells it, but I think it's meant to imply this is the beginning of his turn, that he gets worse, and that his depression, this is where his depression starts, and you see him starting to ask for prescriptions for the other doctor to help him sleep and stuff. So you just assume that in between this and through the Looking Glass flash forwards, that it balloons, his depression and drug addiction balloons. But the journey he takes in this one episode, I think it does happen a bit too fast. I don't think it's the best. I do think it was necessary, so I do think it's okay, but I don't think it was handled quite as well as it could be, because at the start of the episode we show, and I do like this, that they defend, because usually they're stuck in this whole love triangle thing where they're not going to commit Kate to anyone, but I love at the start of this episode, Kate is with Jack. Boom! She is, they're living together, Jack is taking care of Aaron. He even and later in this episode, he even proposes to her, and she says yes. So I love that they were willing to throw that commitment instead of always teetering on the will they won't they bullshit. So that was a huge step. I did like that, but for them to go from Jack at the start of this episode being totally in love with Kate and reading to Aaron, and he's even in a better, more stable position than he was in the Hurley flash forward, and then by the end of the episode, he alienates Kate and totally pisses her off, and is getting all depressed and starting to yell and become more like his drug addict self. And I think that change wasn't handled as well as it could have been. I think that because they have him, he sees visions of his father, and then you get this creepy visit from Hurley, where Hurley is saying that he talks to Charlie, and Jack, of course, dismisses Hurley's crazy, and then Hurley is like, oh, you're not supposed to raise him, and that's creepy. Now, the reason why I think this is okay and not just bad is because I think that kind of works. That does make sense, that creepy messages from people saying, oh, you're not supposed to raise him, and then he also says, oh, you're going to get a visitor, and sure enough, his father starts appearing to him again. So I do see how that would fuck with his mind, but I think that scene we got with him with Kate, where he was yelling at her and he says, you're not even related to him, which also implies, of course, that he knows that he is related to Aaron and Kate's not. I don't think that scene was as earned as it should have been. I think we needed more to see Jack go from perfect, upstanding, happy doctor and who's engaged to be married to crazy, oh, I'm yelling and drinking and blah, blah, blah. You know, you might say, I can just hear some people saying, oh, in real life, people can make that change. But they usually have a pattern of doing that. People who do change that drastically, usually they have a predisposition to depression and alcoholism. And we haven't seen that in Jack. In fact, I mean, you could say it was genetics because his father's an alcoholic. But still, I think we needed a little bit more for his character, just a little bit more. Like, I don't think it's totally contrived. I don't think it's totally out of blue. I think it would have been much worse if they didn't have this episode, because in the flash forward we're meant to believe that all of a sudden he became this drug addict. So this does help that along, and also shows how he and Kate got estranged, which really helps set up for the, through the Looking Glass flash forwards better. But I think they need a little bit more. I don't really buy his change here. I think it was a bit too sudden. Anyway, as for the Island storyline, that was complete. This is like, it felt like a season 1 Island storyline. That is to say, completely unnecessary. And this brings, because the flash forwards I think are actually decent. I think they're the strength of the episode. The Island storyline is definitely the low point of the episode. Jack getting appendicitis and them having to do surgery, and he can't, they had to harp down how he can't give up control and how he needs to be in control and whatever. He can't let go, as they say, which is a recurring motif in the show that they just beat the dead horse with, but I won't get into that. Anyway, so yeah, it's completely unnecessary, and the scenes seemed a bit overly dramatic. I mean, the scene in the tent when they were doing the surgery and Jack wanted Kate to hold the mirror, and of course it didn't work. Of course he started yelling, freaking out, and Juliet told Kate to get out, and she started crying, and it seemed a lot more melodramatic than it needed to be. And then Juliet is a trained doctor. She should have known that Jack's idea wasn't going to fly in the first place, and never should have let Kate go in there in the first place. But whatever. And when I get into how I could tell the first half of the season kind of had a different idea of where they're going, and they kind of changed directions a bit in the second half, it's very evident to me with the scene we get with Juliet talking to Kate about how he wanted Kate in here because he loved her, and that Jack kissed Juliet, but she knew that he was just trying to convince himself that he didn't love someone else, meaning Kate. So, meaning that Jack was actually in love with Kate, not her. Whereas at the start of season 4, the first half, we had this episode, The Other Woman, which I hated, and it implied that Kate and Jack the episode had them kiss. It was definitely, he wasn't doing that to convince himself he was in love with Kate. It was definitely playing up the love between him and Juliet. I mean, the whole flashback was playing towards this, and that's why she was saying, oh, I'm afraid for you, Jack, because Ben is obsessed with me, and he's not going to let me go, and that's why he's going to come after you. So it was implying that Jack and Juliet's relationship was going to go further. It was also implying that it was leading to a showdown between Jack and Ben. None of that happened. All of that was completely forgotten and completely scrapped, and it started here with Juliet saying, oh, I know that kiss didn't mean anything to me, it was just meant to show that, so they want to play into more of Jack's relationship with Kate, which also fits more with the flash forwards where we see they're being engaged. But don't get me wrong, I actually think it was a very smart thing to scrap that storyline with Jack and Juliet and Ben being jealous, because that storyline was dumb. It never should have been in the first place. So they were correcting a mistake, but still, it is an example that to me shows that they kind of is one of many examples to show how they changed direction between the first half and the second half. Yeah, and the rest of the episode, I don't really remember there being anything worth talking about, so let's go ahead and move on to the next episode, which is Cabin Fever. Well, now this, I go back and forth of whether or not I love this episode or if I just think it's a really good episode. which is not a big distinction. But what I love most about this episode are the flashbacks with Locke, and these are the kind of flashbacks that I wish we had more of later. This is what I was expecting for the final seasons of Lost. Alas, we didn't really get these, with one or two exceptions. But I was hoping we'd get a lot more, because this is the character we've known for 4 seasons. We've seen tons and tons of flashbacks. We got his backstory, how he got in the wheelchair, how he had an estranged father, how he thought he was, was pathetic, and then that eventually got to the point where he wanted to go on the walkabout, and even though he was paralyzed. And in this episode, we get tons of these powerful flashbacks that really change what we think of this character, and in a way that's consistent too, and it also beautifully sets up for season 5. That we're told that we see Richard Alpert, of course the guy who never ages from the others, appear at Locke's birth, and then he also appears when Locke is like 6 or 7, and this is really weird thing where it's like, all right, which one of these items belong to you? And Locke answers it wrong, so he gets pissed off and runs off. So it's a cool what-if scenario, that what if Locke got it right? Then Alpert might have taken him back to the island, and Locke could have been raised on the island. Which really, and also it shows when he was a little kid, he drew a picture of the freaking smoke monster killing someone. So it implies that Locke has been connected from the island all along. And that's some really powerful shit, because you knew that he has this strong communion with the island, that he's really in touch with it, but you always think that's just because it healed him. But apparently we're told now that the island was always a part of his life. And then we see him as a teenager, where he's invited to a science camp by Richard Alpert at Middle Biosciences, which we of course know is attached to the others. So again, this is another example of the others trying to recruit him to the island, but of course he's saying, no, I'm not going to do science. I'm not a nerd. I like sports and cars. And I love that, because that again goes with this character about how he was in denial of his true nature, of his true calling, and he's sort of pushing it off. It's also kind of implying that this is not that he's pushing back against this because fate doesn't want him to go to the island yet. They want him to experience all these things before he goes to the island. So it is very powerful. And then, the thing with Matthew Abadan appearing to Locke, suggesting that he go on the walkabout, maybe that's a bit too much of a setup, too bit contrived to be like, oh, I'm the one that told you to go on the walkabout. Alright, we don't really need to see the origins of Locke wanting to go on the walkabout. That was a bit silly. But it was interesting to see him in that state shortly after he was paralyzed, where he's of course depressed and he thinks that he can't do anything. Compare that to the point he's at and his walkabout flashbacks, where he is convinced he can do anything. He can even go on walkabout. So I guess it does kind of make sense that this shows that first push in that right direction, pushing him to be in the mindset that he can do anything. And of course it does lead him to the island. It does ascribe some sort of magical abilities to Matthew Abadan, but don't expect any resolution on that. Anyway, so that's mainly why I love this episode. Those flashbacks were so fucking powerful, and I wish we'd gotten more flashbacks in that same vein. The island story wasn't that bad either, because first of all, we get the storyline on the freighter, which was really intense, with Keamy going off the walls because he after coming back to the freighter from his encounter with Ben, where his people died, and he has a secondary protocol, and he's basically threatening the captain and rolling over the captain like he doesn't exist. So this kind of changes the power dynamic, which again I think is kind of inconsistent with the first half of season 4, but whatever. And he eventually ends up killing the captain because he goes around killing the men because he tries to get when Lapidus refuses to fly him back to the island. So it does play him off as this is the bad guy who's going to kill anyone. Like we didn't already need to know. Like we didn't know that already. But yeah, that whole thing was really intense. And of course, Saeed takes the little raft back to the island to try to start freighting people to the freighter, which sort of sets up for the ending, which is all good stuff. And then you got the storyline with Locke and Hurley and Ben looking for the cabin, which I thought was a bit cheesy. Like the whole concept of the magically moving cabin. I mean, I think that's kind of inconsistent with season 3 because Ben knew where the cabin was, it didn't magically move. Now all of a sudden they don't know where it is and they can't find it, so they need to rely on visions. Whatever. And so I wasn't that big onto that, but it was still interesting. It was still good stuff. So yeah, it was still a really, really good episode. So anyway, let me get into the finale. There's no place like home. Now, this is kind of like Exodus, where they call it a 3-parter, but I refer to it as a 2-parter because usually when there's a 2-hour finale, like Through the Looking Glass or Live Together, Die Alone, I review it as one episode because that's how it was aired. But with this, it's more like Exodus, where I review it as 2 episodes because they air part 1 as its own 1-hour episode 1 week, and then the next week they air part 2 and 3 together as a 2-hour finale. So that's how I see it. Even though technically you go to most websites that will call it 3 parts, I call it 2 parts because I put the 2 episodes that aired together, I consider that 1 part. But since part 1 aired differently a week before, I don't consider that all 1 part. I consider it 2 parts. But anyway, confusing, I know. So, and plus, I think there is a distinct difference in tone between part 1 and part 2 and 3, if you prefer, because part 1 has the flash forwards show exactly what happened after the Oceanic 6 get back to the U.S., to the mainland or whatever. Whereas in part 2, the flash forwards starting after Through the Looking Glass and sort of continue onward, which will of course set up season 5. So I think there's a distinct difference between part 1 and then part 2. Part 2 and 3 I think is 1 part. Well, whereas part 1 is different because it shows immediately after they returned. And I love that symmetry. I love the symmetry to it of how the end of part 2 of There's No Place Like Home with the island storyline, or the prime storyline, or whatever you call it. The timeline is, they're not really on the island anymore, but still it's the same timeline continuously. Where that ends is exactly where the freaking flash forwards in part 1 begin. And again, I love that symmetry of it, how it fit together like that. So this, I don't know, memory-wise, I never remember this being that great of an episode, but when I watch it, I'm always like crying and affected by it. So I think it is a much better episode than I tend to give it credit for. I know some people will put this in their top 10 best. I tend not to, but every time I watch it, I am completely enthralled with it, and do think it was a really effective episode. Now, part 1, the thing with them actually showing them return to the mainland, after they go to this island in Indonesia, but then they're flown to Hawaii, where their families are all waiting for them. That was a very powerful. And then we're introduced, of course, to the Oceanic 6 music, this theme, which will become more present later on in the show. But here is where it's most powerful. Like That scene where like Hurley's reunited with his parents and Jack sees his mother and freaking Sun's reunited with her parents. I mean, that was just like, that was so powerful. Even though like you had all these flash forwards, you knew that they got rescued, and you already saw Hurley with his parents, you knew that all these characters were going to be together. It was still powerful to see that, because this is something the show had been building towards, like from the very beginning, is that they're trapped on this island, they want to return home, and here we see them reach that goal. Now I love how that's not the end of the show, and I've heard some other opinions of people thinking that the show should have ended with them getting off the island, that should have been the end goal, but I completely and utterly disagree with that, and I think, and David Lindelof said that was never the end goal, that was never the main theme, or the end goal of the show. The show was actually always about how the island was special. That is the main theme, not how they're trapped and they need to return home. That's what made the show different. So honestly, I think if that's your opinion, you didn't really get the show. Just my opinion anyway, because I know people throw that term around a lot, which often heavily misuse that phrase, but so I feel bad even using it. But honestly, I don't know what else to say, because I think it's very obvious that the show is about the island being special, not about people trapped getting rescued and returning home. But so I love the fact that it didn't happen at the end of the show. I love the fact that that happens now in season 4, which not technically the halfway point, because probably more towards the end, because seasons 1, 2, and 3 had way more episodes than seasons 4, 5, and 6, and this is towards the end of season 4. So this is towards the end of the run, but still not at the very end. You still have a lot more. You still have 2 more seasons to go. But it was very powerful seeing that. And then that's sort of juxtaposed when we get to part 2, where we see how all their lives are fucked up. And returning home didn't really help. And they're all in bad places, which is also a theme of the show, about how how the island needs them. But anyway, we also get, a lot of other things happen, to sort of a lot of moving pieces. And the island storyline of this episode, and the way that Damon Lindelof once described it is he wanted this part 1 to end with the Oceanic Six all being in totally different places, where the viewer was wondering, how the hell are they going to get together and get off the island? And I think they did definitely succeeded for that, that's for sure. But I don't know how necessary it was to do that. I think they could have maybe focused a bit more on trying to tell a better story. I don't know. Because we had Jack, and Jack was at the helicopter. He met up with Lapidus, and he was going to the greenhouse where the mercenaries were. So he was on his way there. That's how he ends part 1. And then Kate and Saeed were taken prisoner by Richard Alpert and the others. So that's how they end part 1. And Sun is on her way to the freighter in the life raft. That's how she ends part 1. And Hurley is with Locke at the greenhouse, hiding from the mercenaries. And that's how he ends part 1. So they're sort of like, oh, how are they all going to get out of this? I guess Sun's the one who's most, because she's already on her way to the freighter, so that makes most more sense. I guess Jack and Hurley are kind of by the helicopter, but there's mercenaries in the way, so how do they overcome them? And Saeed and Kate, of course, they're taken by the others, so they're the ones that are most, oh my god, how do they get out of this? Of course, in part 2, we find out that the others let them go immediately, so it's kind of anticlimactic, but whatever. I don't know how necessary that was, but it was intense, like getting all the moving pieces going. And of course, in this episode, you get a lot of Ben's attitude. Has a saying where he realizes that he's not in control anymore, and he's ready to give up power to Locke because of the events of what happened with his daughter. So it's mainly the flash forwards that I remember about this episode. The island storyline was mainly just moving the chess pieces around to get them in place. Anyway, let's get into part 2 of There's No Place Like Home. Now, this is the flash forwards start after the Through the Looking Glass flash forward, so we get for the first time we go onwards from them. And this is really interesting because they start the episode with the previously on, and it ends with the flash forward Jack from Through the Looking Glass going, "We have to go back," and then it feeds immediately from that into the same scene continuing onward, which I think is the first time like the previous on actually blends into the actual episode, where we see what happens immediately after Jack screams we have to go back is that Kate backs up with the car and starts yelling at him, which I think totally is obvious that this is not what they were thinking of when they filmed the Through the Looking Glass flash forwards. It's obvious that Kate was meant to drive away, but then later when they went to write this episode, they were like, oh, we want to continue onward for that scene, but hey, wait, we have Kate driving away in that scene. How do we overcome that? Oh, let's just have her back up and get out, which honestly doesn't make sense. Why would Kate back up the car if she hates Jack and wants to get away from him? Whatever. They try to play it off as she got totally angry and let her anger get the better of him, so she backed up so she could yell at him, which I suppose makes sense, but it's still obvious to me that that's not what they were thinking of when they first wrote the scene. But whatever, it kind of works. But and of course the way they're talking really is setting up. It's kind of contrived that it goes together with the events of There's No Place Like Home. Like the way Kate talks about, oh, how dare you, all those horrible things that happened to us the day we left, how dare you want to make us come back. It's obvious they're trying to pair it with that episode because normally wouldn't talk about all the horrible things that happened, and this of course is setting up meta for the events that are about to happen in the island storyline of the same episode. But what's worst example to me is the whole Jeremy Bentham thing. The way that, and I can say this because you have seen the end of the episode, but the way that they refer to Locke as Jeremy Bentham. Because, alright, so this whole mystery at the end of season 3 and Through the Looking Glass flash forward, that there was a coffin and Jack was really depressed, and it's part of the reason he saw the obituary and he went to the coffin to see someone die. It's part of the reason why he was suicidal, is because someone he knew died, but we don't know who this person is. So there's all speculation all the way throughout, the break between season 3 and 4, and then while season 4 is airing, everyone was wondering who's in the damn coffin, and of course it's finally revealed at the end of the episode, and that's the big shocking ending of the episode, which honestly I don't know if I think it's one of the least shocking endings of any of because each finale of each season had a really shocking ending. Like season 1 was Walt got stolen off the raft. Season 2 was I guess the shocking ending was that Penny was actually still alive, still out there looking for Desmond. She was tracking the island thing, the electromagnetic event, or maybe the electromagnetic event itself could be seen as the shocker of season 2. And in season 3, of course, was the whole flash forward, we have to go back. So for me, this is probably the least impressive of them, that, Locke's in the coffin. But it's still shocking. I mean, I just don't think they should have played it for as long as they did. But point is, there was so much speculation of who was in the coffin. So many theories. I heard there was a huge theory around the time this was airing that it was Michael. A large contingent thought it was Michael in the coffin. But by the time you get to this episode, you realize Michael's going to die on the boat. So it wouldn't make much sense for it to be him. The funny thing is that they filmed 3 different versions of the scene of people in the coffin in order to try to throw off spoilers. Because even back here, people were like, as I said, there was a few spoilers I knew about, like such as Tom would appear to Michael off Island. So they were trying to throw off people who were like spoiling things of who was in the coffin. So they filmed, and they actually show, I think you can see this on deleted scenes of the DVD, and there were some news programs on at the time that actually also showed these deleted scenes to try to throw people off. So they filmed Sawyer being in the coffin, and then they filmed Desmond being in the coffin. Of course, once you see the episode, you know Desmond being in the coffin doesn't make much sense, because they make it clear that the person who died came to Jack and said that people on the island needed their help. And we know that Desmond got off the island with them, so it doesn't make sense for it to be Desmond. But you don't know this until this episode aired, and presumably these spoilers are there to throw people off before the episode aired, so that makes sense. But anyway, I guess that's all neither here nor there. So anyway, I got off on a tangent. Jeremy Bentham. The way that they keep referring to Locke as Jeremy Bentham in this episode is very contrived. Because why don't they just call him Locke? It's obvious, because the showrunners don't want the audience to know who it is yet. They want to have this big shocking reveal at the end of the episode. It's Locke! Ah! And so they can't call him Locke, they have to call him Jeremy Bentham. But it doesn't make sense for the characters. Why would they call him by this alias that they barely knew him by? They would just call him Locke. And in fact, you had a scene, the worst example is the scene with Saeed and Hurley, where Saeed's like, Bentham's dead. And Hurley's like, why are you calling him Bentham? His name is, just like, don't say it. Don't say his name, we're being watched. And then, of course, this is getting a slight spoilers of season 5, but come on. If you haven't seen season 5 yet, this isn't going to spoil you in any way. But anyway, in the first episode of season 5, Hurley is like, when Saeed says Jeremy Bentham, Hurley's like, you mean Locke? He's like, yes, I mean Locke. So as soon as we already know that it's Locke, then they immediately go back to calling him Locke. So it's so contrived. Then this episode they're calling him Jeremy Bentham, but they can't give away the big shock, so they have to have him act a bit out of character for whatever. I did find it effective, though, to be clear. I did like the ending. I did like seeing the continuation of Through the Looking Glass. Flash forward that scene where Claire appears to Kate looking over Aaron and saying, don't you dare bring him back. Like, that was a really effective, like, scary horror type, and it goes along with the sort of strangeness of the island. So I did like the flash forwards, but they weren't actually my favorite part of this episode, unlike part 1, whereas actually the island story is a bit stronger to me. Of course, you have the whole thing with the freighter blowing up and Jen dying. Like, that moment, that was so intense, where, like, the helicopter was out of fuel, had to land. Desmond screaming at them, no, don't land. And Lapita's like, I don't give a fuck what he's screaming. We're out of fuel. We need to land. Then they refuel, they take off, and they leave, and they leave Jen behind, and Sun screaming. Like, this is... I'm blanking on her name at the moment, I'm sorry, but the actress who plays Sun, like, to be fair, she's somewhat important to the show, but she's usually not given that much to do. She's not as much as some of the other actors, like the Kate and Juliet and Locke and Sawyer and Jack, are given the most to do. Even arguably Saeed and Desmond are given more to do than she is. So it was really great that this was her moment to shine, and she did. Oh my god, like that. This is the scene I was talking about. I was absolutely crying, even though I've seen this dozens of times before, and I know what happens in the future. It still affected me on this rewatch, because her performance here is just so powerful. She is a really good actor, and you can tell that they just don't give her enough to do normally. And this scene, she really gives us heart-wrenching, like, terrifying, like, the way she screams, and we have to go back. Like, I think is one of the most sort of memorable scenes of the entire show, of showing someone who is emotionally traumatized. by the events. And so when you see the flash forwards and you see how callous that she's become, and then Jack says that Sun does not talk to me anymore because she blames me for Jin's death, like, you buy that, because I was so totally sold. And plus her going to her father and blaming her for Jin's deaths and like totally taking over his company, that you buy all that, because the way she sold how affected she was by Jin's death, like that scream, it was one of the most heart-wrenching moments of the entire show, in my opinion. And the whole sequence with the freighter exploding, it was just so eerie. And the stuff with Kimi, like having the life thing, that if I don't know how that would even work. Why don't they just turn it off? Surely he can turn it off because he's got to take it off eventually. Maybe there's a code or something, but at least they could have explained that. Maybe Locke could have tried to get the code from Kimi. How do you turn this thing off? But of course, Kimi wouldn't give it to him. It's not in his character to do so. He would die being arrogant and take the freighter with him. But I don't really get, like, that was his failsafe, because, so it seems to be banking on the fact that Ben does not want innocent people to die. And that's what he said, that's what he told Michael, that's why the bomb didn't go off. But again, I gotta call bullshit on this. We know that Ben, and it seems like Widmore, if he's someone who does know who Ben is and does know him well, he would know this. He would know that Ben would not give a shit about killing some random people that he doesn't even know or care about on some freighter that Widmore owns, by the way. Why would Ben care about sparing the lives of people who work for Widmore? I mean, we're told Ben claims to, because he claims that with Michael. It's like, oh, I know that these people are just hired by Widmore. They don't know the evil person he was. But that's bullshit. I don't buy that, and I don't think Widmore would buy that. So I don't think it's a good plan. That's his failsafe, is I want to kill a bunch of strangers that work for Widmore on some boat you don't care about. Of course Ben's going to kill him. Now, the episode does kind of try to play it off like he's just so grief-stricken over his daughter that's why he doesn't give a fuck about the people on the freighter. But honestly, I don't think he would. We've seen that's not consistent with the character from season 2 and 3, where he just kills whatever people gets in his way. Like the way he acted at the end of season 3, he's like, go take the pregnant women from the camp, and any men get in your way, kill them. This is the guy we're talking about here. And we're supposed to buy that he gives a fuck about a bunch of people under his worst enemy's payroll? Pfft, come on. Of course he's going to kill Akimi. He doesn't give a fuck about this failsafe. Big little Bob. But other than that, like, I did... Overall, I love this episode. I think it's great. I even like the moving the island, the frozen donkey wood. I have heard some people, in retrospect, think that this is the worst moment in the show, and where the show totally went wrong. Again, I gotta disagree. I gotta totally disagree with that. I think this was a very powerful moment. It was very weird, very sort of in keeping with Lost. It is taking it more of into a fantastical place than the show has ever gone before. But I still think it's a natural progression of where the show's been going. And I don't think it's something that's too crazy that doesn't fit in the dynamics that the show has established. I think it still totally works. And in the best way. Like, it is really enthralling when that island disappears. And then you have... I gotta talk a little bit about the Orchid Station, how you have the Dharma video where they're explaining that they're playing around with time travel. And I love how Locke, after watches the video, goes to Ben. It's like, is he talking about what I think he's talking about? And Ben's like, well, if you mean time traveling bunnies, then yes. This is another thing that was kind of ruined because in Comic-Con, the year, like, it was almost an entire year before this episode aired, because it was before season 4 even aired. It was like in between the break of season 3 and 4. We got this Comic-Con released this video of it was alternate takes of what's his face, Marvin Candle, whatever you want to call him, Dharma Initiative guy, recording this instructional video for the Orchid Station. And it wasn't the actual video that we see in this episode. It was outtakes where he's talking about setting up the thing with time traveling bunnies, and then another rabbit just appears out of nowhere while he's holding the one rabbit. He's like, "What the hell?" And he starts freaking out because obviously that's the future version of the bunny that he's holding. And so we're waiting all season for payoff for this, and we finally got it in the finale. So it's another thing that was kind of ruined. The power of this was kind of lessened because the promotional material just kind of ruined it again. But anyway, still really love that. Love the whole sequence of Jack and all of the Oceanic Six getting rescued by Penny. And it's very like when the helicopter crashes in the water and Desmond is like, you think that he might die, and they're like doing CPR on him, and I'm like, oh no, like it's kind of the way of the writers kind of fucking with you, because Desmond, other than Lapidus, but no one really cares about Lapidus, Desmond was the only one that we don't know survives, because all the other Oceanic Six, Hurley, Jack, Son, Kate, all them, we know that they're, because we've seen them in the future, but we haven't seen Desmond in the future. So that's the possibility that Desmond dies right here, and that's why we don't see him in the future. So they kind of play around, haha. But then, of course, he did survive, because it would have been done to kill him off there, because Penny's the one that comes from him, and they need to have the resolution to the constant where she says, "I tracked you by your phone call," which I think I'm pissed off that they forgot all about the whole scene at the end of season 2 where she's in the Arctic. They have that dude, if you don't notice, the Portuguese dude who said in the Arctic, he's on this boat here when they rescue him. But they said that Penny says, "I found you by the phone call." What about, and she seems to be oblivious to like the island. Like, how does she know there was an electromagnetic event? How does she know about the island? How does she know Desmond was there? Why was she tracking them? Well, how come her tracking that electromagnetic event, how come that wasn't what led her to Desmond? None of this is ever addressed. Not that that spoils anything for you, but maybe don't manage your expectations if you're expecting this to be addressed, because it's fucking not. It pisses me off. Ugh. Again, it's obvious to me that the writers are totally changing directions, and they kind of just want to forget about that season 2 scene, which pisses me off, because I love that season 2 scene. I wanted to see more resolution. Oh, this is the same guy who appeared in it. Even though we're not answering or honoring anything about that scene, here's the guy. Bullshit. But that being said, finally see the scene where Desmond and Penny are reunited. Huge cathartic payoff for their storyline that's been going on for several years. Really powerful way to end the episode and then tie it into the Oceanic Six as well, as Penny is the one who rescues them and finds them and takes them to where they need to go to fake the lie to make it seem like they crashed in a totally opposite direction, but I already went on a diatribe about that in the previous video, so I won't rehash that here. But the ending scenes of them going to the island and getting rescued, and even though you know that they all become unhappy in the future because we're seeing that side by side, it's still extremely powerful. It's still a really great way to end the episode. So anyway, that's all I gotta say about those episodes of season 4. So now, as is customary for each season, as I end the season, I name my 3 least favorite episodes of the season and the 3 best episodes of the season. So, for my least favorite episodes, episode 3, I'm going to have to say Eggtown. It's not an entirely bad episode, but again, this is a really short season, so I'm having to struggle to come up with 3 worse. But Eggtown is kind of a mediocre one. I like the flash forwards with Kate and her lawyer that explain why she's not in jail. But the island storyline was kind of dumb, like going back and forth, and it has a horrible episode title too. Also against it. Second worst of season 4 is Xian, however you pronounce her name. Can never pronounce it right. Again, if you saw my review of this episode, I thought this episode could have been amazing. It had a very powerful ending where they reveal that Jin is actually dead, and it was so powerful, juxtaposed with the flashbacks. But the way they did that fake out with Jin making you think that you're seeing his flash forwards, but really his flashback and this flashback to show him getting the panda bear have fucking nothing to do with anything at all. They're just there to fool you, and I think that is the worst contrived, most assholist thing that Lost has ever done. I think it is cheap, it is lazy, it is disgusting. It fucking pisses me off beyond belief. So that's my second worst. But the worst episode of season 4 is The Other Woman. It's all these episodes in the first half of season 4. The Other Woman was completely horrible. This episode, it makes no sense. It doesn't fit into the overall story of the entire show. It sets up things that are abandoned because they're dumb, such as I was talking about the whole Ben, Jack, and Juliet love triangle, as if we didn't have enough love triangles already. And the flashbacks with them trying to have this stupid psychologist who doesn't really fit into anything, and they try to say that Ben wanted Goodwin to die, that's why he kept him with the tail section. Bullshit! It completely changes the dynamic. It ruins Juliet's character, it ruins Ben's character. It makes no fucking sense why Charlotte and Daniel Faraday are trying to stop the gas. It's just this dumb episode, and it should have never existed. So now let me get into my top 3 favorite episodes, the top 3 best episodes of season 4, and we'll start with my number 3, There's No Place Like Home, and I'll say both parts. Now if you say that's cheating because I said they're 2 different episodes, then fine, it's a tie. It's a tie, parts 1 and 2, There's No Place Like Home. Because even though part 1 I liked better for the flash forwards and part 2 I liked better for the island storyline, I think they were both great, both emotional. Both had moments. I was surprised watching them again. As I said, how much I love these episodes, how much they make me cry, how effective, like Sun screaming at her husband's death, and seeing the Oceanic 6 arrive in Hawaii to greet their families. Like, it is all really well done. Anyway, we'll get to my number 2 second favorite episode of the season, and that is The Shape of Things to Come. As I said, this is a very amazing, powerful episode. The moment with the smoke monster killing all the people was really exciting. It was shocking. It was great. Having the whole storyline, as I said, the character arc for Ben, him coming to grips with the fact that he's not all powerful, him thinking that he's all powerful and he's arrogant and he can save his daughter, and he ends up letting her die and having him say like one of the worst things he could possibly say, but have that be the last words that she ever hears him say. It was very powerful, very emotional. Anyway, get into my number 1, my favorite episode of season 4, and not to anyone's surprise, it is The Constant. The Constant, of course, is a fan favorite for a reason. It's a very powerful time travel episode. It was very trippy. The way it was filmed worked very well. And, of course, you want to talk about an emotional scene. That phone call with Desmond and Penny probably takes the cake. In a show full of emotional scenes, this was probably the strongest, if not one of the strongest. It was amazing acting. It's the reason why Desmond's a fan favorite. Is one of my favorite characters. Extremely powerful episode, The Constant. Anyway, so my rating for season 4 as a whole, out of 10, I think I'm going to give this a 9. Excellent. In the past, I've given this an 8. And there are some weak episodes in the first half of the season. The first half is really slow going. But I think that second half, and most seasons really, it's only the last like 5 or 6 episodes out of 25. But for this season, because it's a shorter season, it's only 14 episodes, or really 13, that the whole second half is, so half of the season is amazing. So that makes this a really good season. And there's only... Well, the Ji-Eon does really piss me off, but it would have been a good episode had they just left that stupid panda thing out. But the only really bad episode this season is The Other Woman. The rest of the episodes are first half. We have some good episodes in the first half, especially The Constant, one of the best. It's not debatable. The Constant is one of the best episodes of the entire show, and that was in the first half of the season. In the second half, it was just all amazing. So I do see why a lot of people like season 4. I don't really like the direction it pushes the show in. I think it forgets a lot of things that made the first 3 seasons great, but judging it as a season on its own right, it does have a lot of great storytelling that is well earned. So anyway, that is it for my spoiler-free section of my video of second half of season 4. So I will be back in 2 weeks for my how I would write season 4 of Lost video. Of course, that will contain spoilers to the end of the show. So if you haven't seen all the way to the end of the show, hold off on watching that, and I'll be back in about a month with where I'm going to start my coverage of season 5. Well, I will also do that in 2 parts because that is a shorter season as well. So yeah, be sure to be caught up on season 5 in a month when I start reviewing season 5. Also be sure to check out my channel as I do many more videos and other shows like Star Trek, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. Thanks a lot for watching. But if you have seen Lost all the way up to the end of the show, you can stick around for my spoiler section, which will begin now. So it's time to get into some spoilers, and as normal, I'll go episode by episode. And with Meet Kevin Johnson, I don't really have anything to say regarding spoilers, so I'll move over to The Shape of Things to Come. Now, this is something I really wanted to talk about. Ben says when Keamy kills his daughter, he says, "You changed the rules." He changed the rules. He keeps going on about changing the rules. He was like in shock. He was so surprised. He couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my God. Because he literally believed. Now, this is something I had to leave out of my sort of diatribe about Ben in my spoiler-free section. Ben, how he was so arrogant, he was so certain he was right. Part of the reason why he was so certain is because apparently there were rules in place preventing Keamy from killing his daughter. And so he was shocked. He was like, oh my God, I can't believe he changed the rules. He was like, couldn't believe it. And then later, when he went to Widmore and he said, I'm going to kill your daughter, and once she's gone, once she's dead, you'll know how I feel, and you'll wish that you never changed the rules. So, what the hell are the rules? Well, I couldn't tell you, nor could anyone else, not even the writers in my opinion, because it was never freaking answered, and I don't think they even know what the fuck the rules are. Now, I think later towards the end of the season when they were asked directly what the deal with the rules are, they were like, well, they kind of like pawned it off like it was no big deal. It's like, well, I don't know, it's just like Ben and Widmore had some set of rules and it didn't really matter. Okay, well, if these rules didn't matter, then why the fuck are they rules? You could call them suggestions. It can be like, he changed the suggestions. Rules are rules. You can't just break rules. If you can just break them whenever you feel like with no consequences, they're not really rules then, are there? They're suggestions. And so, basically, I don't think... I think this is, even though the writers would never admit it, I think this may be another example of them having something in mind but completely changing direction. Or, more likely, they were like, well, this sounds really cool to put in this thing about rules, so let's put that in and we'll come up with something for it later. And they never did. You've seen the end of season 6 if you're watching this section, so you know that they never really do anything interesting with Charles Widmore. Like, his whole storyline just fizzles out. It goes, wah, wah, wah. So, I do think that they had something bigger in plan for Widmore, but like with most of season 6, they just like abandoned it to do, let's have these flash sideways where they go, meet each other and go do. Yeah, I'll get to that when I get to season 6. God, more I think about it, more I'm dreading of watching season 6. I really, really hate it. Anyway, yeah, so the whole thing with the rules is an interesting concept. Unfortunately, they do fuck all with it. So apparently it means nothing. Like, why was... I mean, there had to be, like, something concrete, not just suggestions, not just, like, house rules. Oh, don't leave your, plates on the kitchen table or something. It sounds something more like the rules of gravity or something. Something that the rules of nature, like, that's what is implied here, because Ben was so shocked that fucking Widmore changed the rules. Like, should have been impossible for him to do so. And he couldn't believe it. He even went to Charles, and you'll wish you hadn't changed the rules. So, I don't know. This is really disappointing. Anyway, also regarding this episode, I gotta talk about the smoke monster. This is really inconsistent with where they take the smoke monster, because we learn later the smoke monster is the man in black. He's evil. He tries to leave the island. If he leaves the island, everyone dies. So why is Ben able to call him to kill the mercenaries? I mean, they never really explain the whole Ben calling him thing. He does do it later on in season 5, but that's so he can be judged. Again, that doesn't really make sense why the smoke monster... They never really explained Ben's relationship with the smoke monster or with the others' relationship or what the hell they know about him. I don't know. It's all murky and doesn't make any sense. And so it's weird watching this episode in context of the whole thing, because when you see the smoke monster kill the mercenary, you think, well, that's the man in black. So why is he doing the candidates a favor by killing the people who could easily kill the candidates for him, when his whole point is to want to kill the candidates? So you think that if Kimi was really going to kill everyone on the island, which we're repeatedly told he says he's going to torch the island, you think the smoke monster would leave him alone and just let him do that, because then he would kill, if he killed everyone on the island, he'd kill all the candidates, so then the smoke monster could leave. Problem solved. I don't know. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. Anyway, and I'm pretty sure someone's going to come up with some wild, crazy, backward fansplaining to try to explain it, but please don't. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is Something Nice Back Home. So, Hurley, this is something I wanted to talk about in the beginning of the end, but I forgot to mention it, so I'll have to bring it up here. Is Hurley contradicts himself, particularly in the beginning and the end, because he said, he was telling Jack that the island wants to come back. It's like, it's going to do everything it can to bring us back, and Jack's like, we're never going back. And here he doesn't really say it as strong in as strong terms that they need to go back to the island, but that seems to be what he's implying. He's talking about how Charlie comes to see him and how he thinks that none of this is what's happening. And, he said something like he thought that this is all like a dream and they died on the island, which is that's really fucking with things. First of all, it's fucking with the fan theory that they all died when the plane crashed and the island is a purgatory, which was a very stupid fan theory, which unfortunately I'll have to get into a lot when I cover season 6. But again, it also fucks with season 6, because season 6 had the flash sideways, which again was another sort of purgatory. So they don't throw in lines like that. But anyway, Hurley's saying that the island wants them back and they need to go back. The island, of course, contradicts. And there's no place like home. Oh no, I don't think there's no place. Yeah, there's no place like home when Saeed comes again and was like, we're not going back to the island, are we? And of course in season 5 he outright refuses when Locke says we need to go back. He's like, no, I'm not going back. So how come beginning the end, what, did he change his mind from wanting to go back and thinking that the island really wants them to go back to? It seemed like really plot contrivance to me. Anyway, other thing, Christian Shepherd. Makes no sense. Okay, so we are told to believe, we're led to believe later on, the big revelation is that Christian Shephard is the smoke monster, is the Man in Black, because the Man in Black can take other forms. He even tells Jack that in season 1 when Jack saw him, that was him. So we're led to believe that all of Christian Shephard's appearances in season 4 and 5 are the smoke monster. Now, here's some real issues. In fact, in this episode, Something Nice Back Home, Christian Shephard appears to Jack in L.A. Okay? Think about that. We're told later in season 6 that the smoke monster can't leave the island. In fact, if the smoke monster leaves the island, then that will be the end of the world. In fact, that is his whole end goal. That's the whole purpose. His whole drive in life, his whole goal is to leave the island. And how the fuck did he appear to Jack in Los Angeles? And also, when Christian Shephard first appears to Jack, the smoke alarm goes off. Now, I actually remember in season 5 when people were drafting a theory, they were theorizing that Christian Shephard and Locke after he came back to life in season 5 was the smoke monster, and they brought this up as a possibility that to support the theory, because the smoke alarm went off when Christian Shephard disappeared. Hey, get it? Smoke alarm? Smoke monster. Which may be what they were thinking of when they did the scene, but it does not make sense. Does not in the least match up with what they explain later on, because later on they say if the smoke monster leaves the island, world's over. Wow, how the fuck can he be in Los Angeles then? Anyway, then if that wasn't the smoke monster, who the fuck was that? Why was Christian Shephard appearing to Jack? I don't know. And because they say that in season 1 when Christian Shephard appeared to Jack, it was actually the smoke monster. So this can't be the smoke. Anyway. Next episode is Cabin Fever, and Christian Shephard kind of makes sense here because, all right, we see him in the cabin, and he's speaking to Locke and telling him to move the island, and Claire is with him. And Claire's like acting all drugged and dopey. It's like, don't worry, John, I'm where I need to be. And that kind of makes sense to what we see with Claire later in season 6, that she's gone completely off the deep end as like the Rousseau part 2. And she's French. She refers to Locke, or not Locke, I should call him Flock. I like not Locke better than Flock. But anyway, they refer to the Smoke Monster's version of Locke as her friend. So it kind of makes sense that she's kind of hanging around Christian, and he's got her drinking the Kool-Aid, because we know that's what happens with her in season 6. So that part of it kind of does make sense. But why does he want Locke to move the island? I mean, you could say it's to set the series of events in motion that would allow him to kill the candidates by taking Locke's form, by having Locke die, but that seems really convoluted where he could have just let Kimi kill all the candidates and he'd be set. Anyway, let's, another thing I wanted to say about Cabin Fever is the Alpert Locke connection, which this is actually really smart. I love this. I'll probably talk about this when I do my season 5 review about it. This is one of the few examples in the later season where they set up perfectly by having Alpert introduce which items is yours, and they kind of, the showrunners made the analogy of like the Damin Lama and the Panchit Lama, because the Panchit Lama determines who the next Damin Lama is by assuming that the Damin Lama is reincarnated into another person. So they go to the kids they think is the next person, and they say which of the items belongs to you. So You said that was the scene that was based off of, but this version is a bit more tangible than that because, as we've seen in season 5, Locke actually travels back in time and gives Albert the compass, so it physically belongs to him. And so he goes to in his own time period, he goes to the version of Locke who's just a little kid and asks him. But I don't know, like, Albert doesn't seem to understand how time travel works. Like, just because the future version of Locke gave him an item doesn't mean his younger self wouldn't know what it was. Maybe he thinks there's some mysticism and fate involved, but I don't know. I still thought that it was really cool, and I'll get more into the time traveling compass later on, but the whole concept of it is really cool. But you know, obviously, and the fact that Locke had the smoke monster drawn on his wall, I mean, that obviously got Richard Alpert's attention, but I just think, just because he didn't know what item the future version who was time traveling gave him, he's like, no, fuck you, I'm leaving. Like, I don't know, but of course we can't change the time period because Locke was never recruited by Albert, so they have to keep that intact. Anyway, so let's get into There's No Place Like Home. I don't have anything to say about part 1, so I'll just jump into part 2. Well, I'll say Christian Shepherd still makes no sense, because this is actually a more common thing that people will point out about how the smoke monster can't leave the island. If Christian Shepherd's a smoke monster, he can't leave. But I think the Los Angeles one is worse. But for some reason, people point to this one. That is when Michael is on the boat and Christian Shepherd leaves. Christian Shepherd appears to him just before Michael dies and says, "You can go now, Michael." And then the boat blows up. I don't know, season 4 just seemed obsessed with using Christian Shepherd as the weird guy. I don't think they knew this, he's the smoke monster thing. Although maybe the smoke alarm kind of implies that it does, but they still didn't really know who the smoke monster was at this stage. I don't know, because this doesn't make any sense. He can't leave the island. And he even points out in season 6 that he can't move across water. He needs to be on a boat. He can't just fly across water. How the fuck does this Christian Shepherd just appear and then magically disappear right before the freighter blows up? Oh, and so the other thing I have in my note about this episode says, Walt! No, you gotta talk about Walt, because, alright, I mentioned at the start of this video how they had a plan to overcome the fact that the actor would age naturally, and this plan seemed to make a lot of sense, and that is the flash forwards jump 3 years into the future, where the actor who plays Walt is now the same age as the character of Walt would be, so they can bring the character back, which was, in the podcast and everything, that's pretty much what they implied they would do. We're bringing Walt back. And we got this scene that seemed to confirm. He's like, I don't understand why you were lying. This seems to be setting up for Walt's big return and him integrating back in the story. But as you know, this never happens. And I think, and I'll probably talk more about this when we get to season 5, but it's obvious, beyond obvious to me, that they changed their mind. That I don't know why. Maybe they thought the actor wasn't a good actor anymore. Maybe they thought the character wasn't interested anymore. Maybe Meet Kevin Johnson wasn't as popular as they were hoping it would be. I don't know, but for whatever reason, they're like, nah, let's not have Walt in. So then in season 5, extremely out of character, he says he doesn't want to go back to the island, which is beyond out of character for Walt. And that's not how he's acting in this scene. He's acting like he knows something's up. He wants to be involved. So to me, this was like a perfect setup to bring him back into the story. But for some reason, and plus you don't have to worry about the age difference anymore, because now he is the proper age. But for some reason, they didn't fucking do it. I don't know. They suck. Anyway, I also want to talk briefly about Miles and Charlotte, because they have that scene in this episode where Miles, does this little creepy thing where he knows something about people, and he apparently knows that Charlotte was trying to get back to the island her whole life. We found out next season that it's because this is where she grew up. I think she even mentioned that to Daniel Faraday in this episode, says she thinks she's looking for the place where she grew up. Finds out that she was a member of the Dharma Initiative in season 5. Which, I don't know, they didn't really do much with that. It seems like they just threw that in there because they were obligated to, because they set it up. But, I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense, but they never really developed this as much as they should. And the thing with Miles, he really wants to stay on the island. He's like, no, I'm Daniel Faraday. He's like, I'm not getting across how dire the situation is. And he's like, no, you're very dire. I'm just staying. Why? Why is he staying? In the future seasons, we see that all he wants to do is leave. What does he accomplish? We find out that Marvin Candle is his father, but he doesn't know that. He seemed totally shocked. He had no idea that he came from the island. His mother in flashback said, oh, your father's corpse is someplace you can never go. But it never implies that the island. There's never implied later that he knew he had any connection to the island. And was he still hoping to get the money out of Ben? Then why did he leave with Ben? Why does he want to stay? I don't know. Anyway, that is all I have to say for spoilers. So I will see you guys in 2 weeks for my How I Would Write Season 4 of Lost. Take care.